Shalom Aleichem. Today is Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas Noach, and it's Gimel Chedesh Mar Cheshvan, and it's Friday. So we're learning a Maimer. The Maimer that we're learning is Lahavin Inyan Simchas Teira from the Rebbe, from Tafshin Lamed Hey. And I hope next week to do the Maimer of Bereishis, and then we'll be caught up, because the Maimer after that is Chayisar of Avraham Zaken. But before I start the Shir, I want to mention the fact that today is Gimel Mar Cheshvan, and it's the yahrzeit of the Heilige Ruzhiner Rebbe, Rabbi Sol Ruzhiner. Sol Ruzhiner. So I want to share a little bit about him. First of all, he was the great-grandson of the Mezritcher Maggid. The Mezritcher Maggid's son was of Avraham the Malach. Avraham the Malach's son was Shalom Shachne of Drobich. And he had two sons, an older son who was called Avraham of Drobich, and a younger son who was called Rabbi Sol of Ruzhin. I heard from Rabbi Reuben, Zechena Levracha, my rabbi from Beis David Gershon. And a lot of what I'm going to share here is not so much from the Siches of the Rabbeim, because those stories I already told, is things that I heard from Rabbi Reuben. That the Tzanzer, the Divrei Chaim, said that if there's a simche in the Ruzhiner Mishpacha, the Ruzhiner had 6 sons who had many children of their own, and they were royalty. They were 6 Gedolei Yisrael, 6 Rebbes in 6 different cities who built 6 different dynasties: Sadiger and Bayan and Husyatin and Chortikov. I don't remember all 6. There's probably more. So the Divrei Chaim said that if there's a simcha in the Ruzhiner's Mishpacha and a person doesn't wash, is that I made it b'malchus. If there's a simcha in the Ruzhiner Mishpacha and you don't wash, you're rebelling against the king, because they were Malchus Beis David. They were descendants of the Maggid. The Maggid knew and said he was from David HaMelech, and that's what the Tzanzer said. And the reason that's so peladik is because the Tzanzer had tightness to the Ruzhiners. The Ruzhiner were Russians. And there were certain inyanim that they were not so frum like the Hungarians. And the Tzanzer had tightness to them about these things. And nevertheless, this is what he said, that if there's a simcha in the mishpach of the Beis Ruzhin and you don't wash, you're made of the malchus. He became an orphan at a very early age. I need to tell you that there's a sikha from the Frierdiker Rebbe, which is very precise, where the Frierdiker Rebbe gives an exact account, where he argues that the Ruzhiner was a lot older than people thought. The official presumption is that the Ruzhiner was born in Tovkuf Zayin, 1797, and it passed away in Taf Reish Yud Aleph, which would be 1851, or 1850, which means he lived 54 years. But the previous Rebbe has a sikha where he indicates that the Ruzhiner was considerably older than that, probably 10 years older than that. And it's a precise sikha because he actually says that the reason he's giving the dates is people should figure out how old he was when he was born. But according to, was can I sagen? The Welt sagt is this, that the Ruzhiner was an orphan at a very, very early age. And that the tzaddikim took him to raise him. I forgot which of the tzaddikim took him to raise him. One of the great tzaddikim of Poland took him to raise him. And he was a Kadosh Meracham Meleda. The Ruzhiner, his holiness was known as an infant. Rabbi Reuben told me that when he was a little boy, the biggest Rebbes of Poland used to stand in front of him and tremble out of fear. And it was a combination of who his Zayda was and who his elder Zayda was and who he was as a child. He was an extraordinary child. And of course there are so many stories about the Ruzhiner's childhood that are very famous. There's the story about asking all of Rashi's questions, and he didn't ask the question about Yaakov Avinu's dream, and his Malamed asked him, why aren't you asking a question about Yaakov Avinu's dream, why the Malachim first going up and then coming down? And so the Ruzhiner said it's a dream, and in dreams everything happens upside down. And then of course there's the famous story where they learned in the Gemara, if you forget when Shabbos is, and he said to his Malamed, how could you forget when Shabbos is? And the Malamed tried to explain to him, you get lost in a desert and in a sandstorm, and he wouldn't accept it. So finally the Malamed says to him, Yisraelik, why don't you understand? You're so smart. And the Ruzhiner said, Vale Shabbos is the Himmel anandere, and Shabbos the sky is different. So how could you not know when Shabbos is? And then, of course, there's the Maisa that they tell about the Alter Rebbe, the Ruzhiner, which, according to the previous Rebbe's Mesoda that I mentioned a moment ago, l'chayre cannot be true. That Imyat Alter Rebbe is a 7-year-old in Tovkuf Samach Gimel, or something like that. And the Alter Rebbe was traveling, and the Ruzhiner was traveling, and they told the Alter Rebbe that the Rebbe is Einiklach, the Mesitcher Mag is Einiklach, the Malach's Einiklach were in the other wagon. But Avram was older. And the Alter Rebbe said, bring them in. And the two of them came in, and the young Ruzhiner Rebbe said to the Alter Rebbe, if a person says Shema Yisrael Havai Elokeinu Havai Echad, how can you follow that up with saying V'ahavta? And the Alter Rebbe told him, because in between you say Baruch Shem Kved Mechusa Leilam Vod. When the children left, Alter Rebbe turned to the Chassidim and he said, this little boy just asked a question. You don't even know what his question was. This is a sipur which is famous by us and by Ander, I presume. But like I said, according to the Maseda that the Frierdiker Rebbe gave, that the Ruzhiner was considerably older than Tzemach Tzedek, not younger than Tzemach Tzedek. It's hard to understand how the story could have happened. Rabbi Reuben told me that by his chasaneh, he was Masama Bar Mitzvah, they got married very young. The Shpola Zayda was dancing. Shpola Zayda was a Kanho Admoirim, right? He was called Shpola Zayda, it says in the Rebbe's Rishimit, because he became a Rebbe at an old age. Not like the stories that they brought from Fola Khan. And the Shpola Zayda was famous for his dancing, right? Al Yohan Levi taught him how to dance. Kidu Asipur. So the Ruzhiner was a little boy. He was sitting at the head of the table, and the Shpola Zayda was much older than he was, and he was dancing in front of him, and he's watching him, and he says to the person sitting next to him, der junge Mann tanzt gut. This man, I don't say junge Mann. Tanzt gut, he's dancing well. And of course he didn't mean that he had good moves. He meant whatever the dinyan of dancing means, l'mayla. Rabbi Reuben told me that the Ruzhiner couldn't write. It was hard for him to write. And they used to say that the reason he doesn't know how to write is because schreiben lernt man sich als Kind. Ich bin keinmal kein Kind nicht gewesen. You learn how to write as a child. I was never a child. You learn how to write as a child. I was never a child. He also told me, Rabbi Reuben, that the Ruzhiner Rebbe used to say, as my melamed gewend der chai der chol chai. He never had a teacher. He was orphaned. He was by himself. He says, my teacher was the Eibishter himself. He also told me that if the Ruzhiner would refer to anybody as a Rebbe, it was the Apterov. But he said that who taught me Torah? The Eibishter himself. He was a tzaddik Elyon. He was a very in the world of tzaddikim of Chassidus. The Ruzhiner was in a class by himself. He was respected by everybody. And if you know anything about the Chassidus of Ruzhin, there's malchus. There's a royalty about them. They're always very neat and clean. They wear a shtreimel with a pointed yarmulke in the middle rather than a flat yarmulke. To this day, the descendants of the Ruzhin Rebbe wear pointed shtreimelach, and it's distinct. Only they wear this shtreimel, and it's considered a simon of keser, of a crown of malchus. And the Ruzhin was a very big Rebbe, and he lived most of his life in Russia. Ruzhin is in Russia. And Ruzhin is a Russian Chassidus. The style of the Chassidus. If you see Ruzhin and you see Stoliner, we Chabadnikis feel more kin with them than we would with, let's say, Baba Chassidim or Tzanzer Chassidim, because Rosh Chassidus is a different style, and even Ger Chassidus, it's a different style. At the end of his life, of course, he had to run away from Russia, as we all know the stories. But he was a famous Rebbe, very, very famous Rebbe. And he had a hanhog of Ashidus. He lived like a rich man, like a Grisa Oisher. He had a lot of money, and he lived in a palace, as did his children. And of course, the Rebbe once told a story by Fabringen, the Rebbe Tibbet erzählt, that the Ruzhiner once came out to Kiddush Levana wearing gilded shoes. Shoes made with gold thread, I'm assuming. I don't think they were made of gold. You can't sit in shoes with gold. Very beautiful, very, very expensive shoes. Extraordinarily expensive. And when he finished Kiddush Levana, they saw on the ice blood, because the shoes had no soles. The Rebbe Tibbet erzählt, I heard this from the Rebbe myself. So the hog of the Ruzhiner was very interesting, was on hog of Ashiris, but nobody questioned his legitimacy. You know, the mice with the Rebbe Marash that he had on hog of Ashiris, and the Chassidim people said, what kind of Rebbe is this who lives like a millionaire? Tzaddikim found the mice. The Rebbe told by Fabringen, his grandfather's name was Emir Shleiman, that means Rebbe Sachana's father, and he was a Yossi by the Rebbe Marash in Lubavitch. And somebody once asked him, how does it make sense that a Rebbe should live rich? It seems it seems inappropriate. It seems almost defeating the definition of what a tzaddik is. So the Meir Shlomo said to him that it says in the Chazal that gold is a precious metal, and it has very unique properties, and the world was not worthy of receiving gold. Gold was created for the Beis HaMikdash. Once the Beis HaMikdash has gold, there's gold also in Liyum Hazeh. So he said to him, Petach, fool. In this generation, for whom was gold created, it's not for the Rebbe Marash. And the Ruzhiner was in a similar style, a similar type, in an hug of Greis Hashiris. The Tzemach Tzedek and the Ruzhiner never met physically, but they knew about each other. The Tzemach Tzedek used to send shluchim to the Ruzhiner, and I'm imagining the Ruzhiner sent shluchim to the Tzemach Tzedek. One of the most interesting stories is the Nesias of the Tzemach Tzedek. Yeah, when the Mittler Rebbe passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek was about 38. How old was the Ruzhiner? It depends on which Maseda, right? If you follow the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maseda, he was older than 38, but according to the Welt, he was 31 or 32. I'm sorry that I'm saying both cheshbonis. It's a chassaron in me. But in any case, so the story was that the Mittler Rebbe was nostalgic and the Tzemach Tzedek refused to be Rebbe. So the Lubavitcher Chassidim went to Ruzhiner. The Ruzhiner said, "Tzaddik, have another Rebbe." They came for Shavuos, and the Ruzhiner Rebbe ignored them. The Ruzhiner used to give shalom. The derech of Chassid, the Rebbe, the Admorei Polen was they gave shalom. They gave you a hand. In Chabad, you didn't shake a Rebbe's hand, but by Chassidei Polen, you'd give the Rebbe a hand. And he ignored them, which was very uncharacteristic. He ignored them out of Yom Tov, ignored them the first night until the first afternoon of Shavuos. And he was sitting at his table, and he said, "There's a medrash pliya. There's a medrash which nobody understands. It says, that the signature of the Eibush, there is emes, as it says, Bereshis bara Elokim." So he interpreted that the Sefer Tevis, Bereshis, the last letter of Bereshis, the last letter of bara, and the last letter of Elokim is Begematria emes. Beresh Tevis emes, truth. And the Eibush's chesima, the Eibush's signature is emes. That's the pshat in the medrash. And then he added, "Un emes is a Rosh Tevis. Teres Menachem emes. Teres Menachem oyer." That's what he says. Emes is an abbreviation. Teres Menachem emes. And some Tzedek's name was Menachem. Teres Menachem oyer. And he turned to two Lubavitcher Chassidim who he had been ignoring, and he said to them, "Fortin Lubavitcher Hatareb." This is the story. The Tzemach Tzedek was sitting that same afternoon by his table, and of course there was no there was telepathy. There wasn't any wires. And the Tzemach Tzedek suddenly says it is a medrash pliya. And the medrash pliya says that that the Eibush assigns his name emes or emes, and he said that this is because Bereshis bara Elokim is Sefer Tevis emes, and Hashem's signature, Hashem signs his name, he signs emes. And then he said, and he laughed. There are people who have from this an abbreviation, then he left. A few days later, when the Chassidim came from Ruzhiner to Lubavitch, and they repeated what they heard, so the Chassidim understood that these two men were connected. So they never met physically, but there's many stories about their hiskashros, including in the Frierdiker Rebbe's letters, in which he describes at length the Shabbos that Rabbi Isaac Homler spent in Ruzhiner. I've told those stories on other occasions. I'm assuming they're already up online, so I'm not going to tell them this morning. But the word that's brought is that the Tzemach Tzedek used to send shluchim to the Ruzhiner with all kinds of questions. And the Ruzhiner said, "Velmonton de brillen, put on our glasses." And I heard from people that when a tzaddik puts on his glasses, it means he's focusing on one point. Me wird sagen a paar kapitlach tilim from the heilige Zayde David HaMelech. We'll say a few holy psalms from our holy grandfather David HaMelech. Men wird sehen, was soll men sagen. And we'll see what we should say. That's the Derech HaKodesh. We'll see what we should say. Men sehen, was men soll sagen. And the Ruzhiner said Tilim, and he gave the Shliach an Eitzah that the Tzemach Tzedek wanted. The Ruzhiner sat in jail for a year and a half, which is a very long time for a tzaddik like that, because he was accused of doing something terrible, which apparently wasn't true. which wasn't true, but he sat in jail, and he eventually escaped Russia, and he had to leave the country. And he moved to Galicia, I guess, and he established himself in Sadiger, which is where Ibn Chasei covered, that's where he's laying. And that's why the Hasidus moved from Russia to out of Russia. But the story was that he had a Chassid who was a contractor by profession. And he came to his Rebbe and he said that the government is giving out a contract for building prisons. And he asked the Ruzhiner if he should give in a bid, if he should put in a bid. And the Ruzhiner should put in a bid, and he should make sure to get the contract. And then when he builds the prisons, he should build one cell with a secret passage. So the Chassid put in obviously a low bid, he got the contract, he built the prison, and in one of the cells he built a secret door, and behind the secret door was a passage. When the Ruzhiner was incarcerated, the Chassidim snuck in one Chassid to be with the Rebbe in Pashbim Shamishim. And they would stay with the Rebbe in Nachanan the whole time. And when the guards would come around, they would go into the secret passage and they wouldn't know that he was there. And they would alternate. Another one would come and they would replace each other. And the Ruzhiner was never alone while he was in prison. I forgot where I read the story, but I read the story. If he escaped from Russia, he had to leave Russia. And he moved to Sadiger, and this is where Shomanu Chasei covered. One of the things which is very famous about the Ruzhiner is that he was an incredibly great collector of Kisvei Yad Kodesh. He would pay large amounts of money for a manuscript of a Ksav Yad Kodesh, of a holy hand of one of the tzaddikim, of the Baal Shem Tov and Talmidei Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, the Midia Magid, and the Alter Rebbe and his Chaverim. And the famous Geniza HaChersonis, which was discovered in 1918 in Kherson, that our Rabbeim held was legitimate and revered and so forth, the Rebbe suggests that that was a collection which the Ruzhiner had, and then when the government was going to confiscate it, he quickly made copies and gave the government the copies, not the originals. And the originals are lost, and the copies the government preserved and saved Kol Soif, and ended up in the right hand and was printed in the Hatomim and so on and so forth. The story Rabbi Reuben told me, the last story that I want to share, is that he was sitting in a chair, the Heilige Ruzhiner Rebbe. He was 54 years old. Again, that's the traditional presumption. And he said, "Metutav da arbeit begeizahem." You finish your work and you go home. And he turned his face, and he was nostalgic. He passed away. That's how he passionate. Mom is sitting in a chair. Misas nishikin. The jokes that they say, these are stories which are hard to understand. That the Ruzhiner was like, "Ich habe 6 Kinder und 6 Pferde." I have 6 sons and 6 horses. There was a lot of anhagas by the Ruzhiner, and they were very ruchniistic. And he rode with 6 horses, and he said, "Ich habe 6 Zin und 6 Pferd." And it was an inya pnimi, obviously. He wasn't talking about horses in the conventional sense. Rabbi Reuben told me that the Ruzhiner told his children that between them there must be shalom. Between them there has to be shalom. Because the shalom between the 6 sons of the Ruzhiner Rebbe is Negei L'mayla. And there was shalom. There was a lot of shalom between the Ruzhiner's kinder. Chach afilu. There may have been some tightness about the Hanhaga of the Mishpachas Beis Ruzhin, like I said to you before, because they came from Russia, and there were different customs in Russia than in other places, and people had tightness to them. But Tzevish and Ziach, it was very, very important that there should be shalom between the different branches of Mishpachas Ruzhin. And I heard Rabbi Reuben told me that the Ruzhin had a len gezagt. This is Negei, the Inyanim was his L'mayla. Anyway, the Rikis is Maisis from Tzadikim. Heintes is Yortzeit. And like I said, he had a very strong relationship with Rabbi Seinu Nisienu. So I began the shir with more than a normal segment of introduction. The Ruzhin doesn't need our chusim. We need his chusim. But the Rikis is a Mashiach. It's a gekochte Mashiach. His whole Metzias was Mashiach. So Zayin des Gals Bepel Mamish.